epidemic. 1603 was a bad outbreak, 1625, 1655, of course, the Great Plague. Then civil war broke out in 1642 and ravaged the country for many years. And the Great Fire swept across most of the city in 1666. So some Londoners, of course, have become famous for their recollections of these events, like Samuel Pepys. But today I'd like to share with you my discoveries when I was researching who was the jeweller of the Cheapside Hoard, so two unknown Londoners. What was the Cheapside Hoard? Well, many of you will have seen this particular hoard. Next, please. In the Museum of London, it used to be in the Tudor and Stuart galleries, and more recently, in 2013, it was on special exhibition together with those chains and rings in the British Museum and the Victoria and Albert Museum. It's the biggest hoard of late 16th and early 17th century jewellery ever to be unearthed from British soil, and tells us a huge amount about jewellery of the period. You can see some eye-popping pieces there, like the emerald watch. That would be at the top end of the scale of values, whereas the little chains with the tiny gems would have been towards the bottom, that is, of valuations of the period, things that much less affluent people could have afforded. Well, just to recap very quickly where the hoard was found, we know from the first catalogue of the Cheapside Hoard that it was found on the site of the later Wakefield House. Next slide, please. This was between Friday Street and Fountain Court, to the south side of Cheapside. This is an engineer's plan in the London Metropolitan Archives, and the street numbers are quite clear there, 30, 31 and 32, indicating the site of the later Wakefield House. Wakefield House is known in the London directories from 1916, and it was named after the Lord Mayor of that year, Sir Charles Wakefield. He was a particularly liked individual, and also very, very important for the period, because he was the inventor of the lubricating oil Castrol. And given that we were in the middle of the First World War then, you can imagine that that was a very significant development. The blue on the slide is all Goldsmiths Company property, and down on the left there's a big block there, which on my slide looks rather uncoloured, but it might come up green on yours, or certainly does on the original. That was the demolished church of St Matthew, Friday Street. And indeed, after this development in 1911, which is the date of the plan, the Goldsmiths Company took over that site as well. And many of you who have walked down Cheapside today will know one new change. And this is on the eastern edge of one new change today. So it's more or less opposite Wood Street. Next slide, please. And if we go back in time into the 18th century, you can see the ringed area there. This is Richard Horwood's map of 1799, and it is the first map that has street numbering on it. And so you can pinpoint again that 31 and 32 Cheapside. It was a tiny parish, St Matthew, Friday Street. It all amounted to that bit of Cheapside, and then part of Friday Street, and the church, of course, of St Matthew itself, which is the dark block there beneath the blue ring. Tiny parish, probably everybody knew everybody else, and quite likely quite a lot of their business as well. Well, next slide, please. If we go back again into the 17th century, the challenge was to find out which of these leaseholds properties owned by the Goldsmith Company, shown here on the map by John Ward of 1692, actually was part of Wakefield House, that is 30 to 32 Cheapside. Well, fortunately, there's a rental which also survives with this survey, and that tells us who was living where. And to cut a long story short, I was able to determine that it was the leases of 26, 27, 28, 29, and oh, there's a little shop there, 30 under the blue ring, that were on the site of Wakefield House. So I was lucky to find quite an interesting character, one of the goldsmiths who lived and worked there, a man called William Gibbon, who lived there and worked by 1662. In fact, he'd retired from goldsmithing in that year. He'd had a very successful career. And there are some rather poignant memories, in a way, of his losses during the Great Fire. But also in this circle, you will see the properties 31 and 32 outlined. And my search for the goldsmith or jeweler who actually was responsible for the hoard took me to that property, but particularly the area of land that they owned, which abutted 28 and the yard of 26 and 27. Next slide, please. And here we have it in greater detail, so you can see 26, 27, 28, 29, and 50, the shop, that's Wakefield House. But the jeweler actually lived in 32, but whose property spread westward to abut the boundary walls of 28 and 26 and 27. We know that because the wardens of the Goldsmith Company had to have access through that yard to inspect his chimneys of his parlour. And so the property filled in that blank space that you see there. Next slide, please. Well, William Gibbon, who was one of the goldsmiths living on the site of Wakefield House, it was actually known as the Blackmoor's Head in the 17th and 18th century. He'd been very successful with his partner Thomas Smith there until 1662. And in that year, he took on another position. He became treasurer of Christ's Hospital. And it's still the custom today at Christ's Hospital to have the treasurer's portrait painted. And this one, like all the other treasurers, is in the courtroom there at Christ's Hospital down at Horsham. We heard a bit earlier about Christ's Hospital. Of course, it is the charity for orphan children. And it was the position, it seemed, that eminent Londoners would sometimes be called upon to take these positions in the city's charitable institutions. Others might be governors of Bridewell and so on. Well, William Gibbon suffered greatly during the fire of London and lost all his leasehold property. And just to read from E.H. Pierce's Annals of Christ's Hospital, it's just a nice little insight, I think, about William Gibbon. Pierce records that Gibbons was in a bad way and wanted to resign. It had, quote, pleased Almighty God very much to impair his estate by the late fire. But he was even more troubled by the, quote, lameness in one of his legs. He seemed of a nervous disposition, For when they told him to go on in his office and cheerfully execute the same, he took courage and did as he was told. And in fact, he did as he was told until 1679, the year of his death. So he worked up until he was in his 70s. Well, Gibbons lost a lot of money, but he was very fortunate in that he had a position at Christ's Hospital, and the hospital also paid his rent, because the treasurer's house, then of course the hospital was at Newgate, not far from Cheapside. That had been burnt, and so the hospital paid his rent and his salary up until 1679. And Gibbon asked to be buried in the cloister of Christ's Hospital, and that indeed was done. And up at LMA, London Metropolitan Archives, there is a photograph of the headstone that was erected in his memory in the early 18th century. And also there are the wonderfully scripted account books that Gibbons kept of the record of his treasuryship, because as you'll appreciate, treasuries in those days had to raise the money as well as spend it. So he must have been regarded as a very very efficient treasurer and goldsmith. Thank you. Well, I wanted to go on to the goldsmith who is really our protagonist. He is the one who lived on the site of 32 Cheapside, but whose property abutted. And his name was Francis Simpson. And he'd been living there since 1634, at least. His father had the lease from 1624, and we know that Francis Simpson was working for the Crown in the late 1620s because of what he was supplying to the court. His father, Thomas, had died in 1631, so the focus is really on Francis Simpson and his brother John. Well, we might never have discovered this story about the Cheapside Hoard, or indeed the Cheapside Hoard itself, if it hadn't been for the fact that he got into trouble with the Goldsmiths Company about his lease. Now, the lease that his father Thomas had taken out duly expired at midsummer 1641. And as early as 1638, the Goldsmiths Company approached Francis Simpson asking what fine or what deposit he was going to pay to renew his lease. Well, you can tell that he was a very different character from William Gibbon, this rather nervous, God-fearing individual. They asked him how long he would take to decide, and he says, till doomsday. And the company write down in their minutes, this was considered scornful and affronting, but he was given 20 days. Well, 20 days came and went, and so in fact did the rest of 1641, and no decision was made about renewing this lease. Well, come 1642, the position in London was much more tense politically, as you'll appreciate. Charles I had tried to arrest the 5 members of Parliament who'd escaped back to the city, and the court had decamped to Hampton Court because it was considered too unsafe to stay in London. And it was at this time that Francis Simpson, who had really thrown in his lot with the Royal Court, left London. We know this because of the letters that he sends to the company about this lease. Well, the court moves ultimately to Oxford and sets up the Oxford Parliament. And it was there on the very day that civil war broke out, on the 27th of August, 1642, that the company that he had sent a letter to the company with the warrant from the Queen saying, oh, you can have a buck for dinner. Well, this didn't go down very well, the company at the time, and they declined this present. But we can see that Francis is trying to keep in with the Goldsmith Company at this time. And it's a bit surprising in a way that the company keep the books open, so to speak, with Francis, because they continue negotiating about this lease. And the Battle of Edgehill is October 1642, the Battle of Brentford, November 1642, the standoff at Turnham Green. And still in 1643, he's writing, saying he can't come to London before Lady Day, 25th of March. But he sends a letter, and I quote this from the court minutes, sealed up in a paper, but the letter had neither date nor place set down from whence it came. The bringer thereof was George Smith at Sir Maurice Abbott's house in Cornhill. That's where the East India Company headquarters. It was now read, and being of a high nature, entreating the company about granting of a lease of the tenement in Cheap, which he usually withholds from the company without lease. It was put aside for further consideration. Well, this is 1643. By then, unfortunately for Francis, the tables are turning against him because Parliament has already set up a committee for sequestration, that is, property that could be seized from royalists and relet, and the money used for parliamentary purposes. And the Cheapside property of Francis Simpson is duly seized, and he's declared a delinquent, which was the contemporary term for supporter of Charles I. So from 1643, in fact, he has no property in Cheapside. Well, how about his position in the Oxford court? He's doing extremely well, in fact. He's appointed royal jeweller. That is a formal position of royal jeweller in 1642. And the following year, in 1643, he has to take on extra duties because the royal goldsmith dies, Alexander Herriot. And he's asked to also create badges of honor. That is those marvelous, almost 3D medallions that hang like on the garter chain with the image of St. George spearing the dragon. We don't have any evidence that he ever did make any of them, but that was certainly added to the list of his supposed work. Well, we know that the Oxford garrison surrendered to Parliament in 1646, and Francis Simpson returned to London. We can only presume that it was to get his hands again on this lease in Cheapside and his jewellery in his workshop. But he was arrested and he was sent to the Wood Street counter or local prison. It's largely a debtor's prison. And he was there for many months before his case was called at Westminster, and he was brought to the bar at Westminster, and he was formally charged with not paying the sequestration dues, and he wasn't released at that point. But in 1650, we know that he was living in Drury Lane. He's still termed a delinquent, but a jeweller, and we can only suppose that he was making money from some of the nobility who were now living in the Covent Garden area and the developing West End. He would have been prohibited from re-entering London because there was an Act of Parliament which stopped royalists from going back into the city. But come the Restoration, he bounces back and he writes a letter to the Goldsmiths Company requesting his lease. the contents thereof very tedious, and many impertinences therein, say the goldsmiths. The particular proceedings are so many and large entries thereof in several books belonging to the company that they are too tedious to insert a report, that a verbal answer will suffice. So they've rebuffed Francis Simpson at this point in 1660, and that is all that he can do, really, because he has no particular answer, even though he turns up in person at the court of the company. The company say everything they've done is fair and just, and there can be no complaint. And so departed Mr. Simpson. Was that the end of the matter? Oh no, he then put in a petition to the government saying, I want £20,000 to cover the cost of sequestration and plunder. Well, there's no evidence that he obtained any of that. But he went off to live in Axe Yard in Westminster, and he was reappointed as royal jeweller to Charles II. And there are lists of the splendid bespoke diamond jewellery which he produced for the court. So there we have two individuals, one the God-fearing, rather conservative William Gibbon, and the other Francis Simpson, quite arrogant and tactless, certainly in terms of the Goldsmiths Company, but both survivors and very successful survivors, and Francis Simpson particularly driven, it would seem, by his need to regain his lease. Thank you.
Thank you, Rosemary, for that wonderful story that you've told us there. You did tell me you would finish on a story, and you finished on a story. So thank you for that. Well, attendees, audience, before we turn over to the last matters for the day, do you have any questions or comments that you could post in chat or Q&A through to Rosemary? I'll give you a moment to do that. And whilst you're doing that, Rosemary, I've got one question that came in more directly to me. The question is, hoards are not totally unusual, if infrequent, and the Cheapside hoard could well have been one of a number of practices at the time. Do you, in your dreams, hope there is another equivalent hoard somewhere in the area? Do you think it was a practice that might well have been used elsewhere?
Of burying
yes,
jewellery.
I guess, yes.
Oh, yes. I think jewellery was buried elsewhere. Certainly, there are medieval hoards, which you will find written up. Yes, indeed. Under times of stress and in times of dire emergency, people did. And Samuel Pepys again hid a lot of money in the garden of his house in Brampton in Cambridgeshire. Yes.
Okay, thank you. And Melanie Winter asks a question. She says, so which of them left the hoard? Was it stuck in the property as it belonged to Francis, but he could not get at it?
Yes, indeed, absolutely. He couldn't get at it, precisely. To our benefit, the present day.
Okay, and thank you, Rosemary. And I think that's bringing us towards the end of our presenters, but please stay with us, everyone. There's a couple more matters to attend to.